We were slaves. We belonged to people. They sell us like they sell horses and cows and hogs and all like that. Have an auction bench and they put you up on the bench and bid on you, the same as you're bidding on cattle, you know. And we'd run away and wouldn't stay with them, or then we'd just go and stay in where we could. If I thought, had any idea that I'd ever be a slave again, I'd take a gun and just end it all right away. Because you're nothing but a dog. You're not a thing but a dog.
I'm Angela Davis. I've been a university professor for many years. I was born in Birmingham, Alabama. I was actually reared under conditions of absolute segregation. And I think my political consciousness came largely from my parents, and specifically from my mother, who was a major activist before I was born and during the time I was very young. I do remember thinking about slavery a great deal, even though at that particular time there was not a great deal of material. I remember looking at my grandmother, who I thought was very old, and she was probably younger than I am now, but I imagined her as having a connection to slavery because I had seen images of Black people who were enslaved, and they reminded me of my grandmother. And I often ask her about slavery. Of course, she had not experienced slavery herself, but she was the daughter of slaves. And that was a topic she did not want to talk about. There was an absolute reticence on her part. And I discovered that to be the case among many older Black people. It was almost as if bringing up the topic of slavery would have the magical effect of bringing slavery back. And that's something I'll never forget. But it made me want to know more about the nature of slavery. And as soon as I was capable of reading the materials that did exist at that time, I did.
No soap, no starch, nobody to wash my clothes, nobody to wash my clothes.
Oftentimes, it is assumed that when we evoke slavery, we're only talking about violence and repression and the worst forms of oppression inflicted on Black people. And of course, that's true. We all know that that's true. But for a very long time, we imagined slavery without having the capacity to imagine the subjectivities of Black people who were enslaved. The objectification of slaves simply as objects of violence managed to destroy the very possibility of our imagining people who were enslaved as being just like us, with an interior life that is, of course, historically situated, but similar to our own interior lives. Oftentimes, what's missing is the resistance and the numerous ways in which Black people managed to create lives and to create beauty and to experience love in the process of fighting this horrendous racist system of slavery. I'm actually often quite critical of films, for example, that assume that if you want to represent slavery, you represent the violence, the whippings, the whip, the scars. And that's one part of it. But the most important part of it is the way in which Black people managed to create beauty and love in the very process of fighting this system. And I want to pay tribute to Toni Morrison, who really began to shift the ground in writing about Beloved, of course. We get to participate in the processes of thinking and feeling and loving and hating. And we never had access to that kind of material on slavery. And I think it's so important to point out that art and fiction play a role in generating our capacity to identify with other human beings. And that is remarkable to think about the fact that every generation has to pass down to the next generation of this impulse to stand up and fight back. And at the same time, this recognition that music and art and love incorporate the desires for the future, the desires that we collectively experience, that populate our collective imagination and allow us to move in the direction of emancipation. And the aesthetic dimension is always so important because even as Black people were suffering, they sang.
Now don't get me here. Oh, 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 oh,
Singing created a dimension that transcended the violence and the oppression, the work songs, for example, that were produced even as Black people were engaging in laborious work, picking cotton or working on the railroad, because slaves actually did do that kind of industrial work as well. The capacity to inhabit an oppressive set of circumstances and at the same time to transcend them through song, through beauty. This is why I think people all over the world are interested in the trajectory of Black struggles. And I think even today, Black people in the Americas and here in the US represent an impulse for freedom and democracy. So it's not because of all of the suffering and pain that people identify with Black people. It is because there has been this unbroken history of struggle for liberation for hundreds of years. If you stop and think about it, that is really remarkable. It's so amazing that 400 years, or one could say even 500 years after the first people of African descent were deposited in this part of the world, in this hemisphere. And I'm thinking about 1526. I know we usually use the date 1619, but people were brought as slaves earlier on to the US, to South America, Colombia, for example. And the fact that we're still here, I think it's important also to point out that our ancestors were assisted by indigenous people, and that probably this trajectory of struggle for freedom would not have happened if not for the assistance of the original peoples of this hemisphere, the indigenous people.
I think I hear the captain calling. Blow, Connie, blow. I think I hear the captain calling. Blow, Connie, blow.
Black love is collective love. It's not only love for the individual, it's love for the community. And it has to do with a consciousness that allows us to feel a responsibility for those with whom we cohabit this earth. I think that today in the 21st century, we still have a great deal to learn from that process. We have a great deal to learn from the many expressions of Black love.